Cbus, as most of you will be aware, is the super fund for those that shape Australia. We manage about $70 billion of funds under management, and about 40% of that is managed internally across a range of different asset classes. One of the things that really struck me when preparing for this presentation was actually the similarities and alignment in terms of MECLA's objectives and Cbus's approach to responsible investment. For example, MECLA uses a number of different levers to improve, create and partner to drive down embodied carbon through focus on things like policy, procurement contract considerations, providing confidence to manufacturers to actually invest in and produce lower carbon materials, organisational change and knowledge sharing, and then increasing data provision. All those things are things that we think about as well in terms of the way that we go about responsible investing. As Monica said, I'm Ros McKay and I head up the responsible investment team at Cbus, and I am absolutely delighted to be here today hosting this event on behalf of Cbus. Great knowledge sharing and collaborative opportunity. Now, while I don't want to mention you all, and Monica's obviously highlighted some of the attendees and the types of organisations, I think it's really helpful to understand who is participating today and just reflect on that. We do have representatives from the finance industry, from government, from property and infrastructure companies and hard to abate sectors, property and infrastructure benchmark setters and collaborative initiatives. And so this really is quite a unique opportunity to connect the dots, start conversations and start solving for and creating opportunities to tackle supply chain transition risks through building on, and no pun intended, insert laugh, by building on existing momentum and collaboration. But I did want to take a step back for a minute and talk about climate change at Cbus and how we think about it. Our board believe that climate change is one of the most significant and most pressing issues that we're facing. We established our first climate change position statement in 2016. And many of our members are going to be retiring at the time when the physical and financial impacts of climate change are really intensifying. So to help us with our work in this space, we develop roadmaps, climate change roadmaps. They run for 2 years at a time. They outline the actions that will help us reach our goals, and we report against them annually so that we can demonstrate progress. In terms of what's relevant to this audience today, in our first roadmap, we set expectations for our property managers to set a clear path to net zero by 2030, and we've seen some really great progress with Cbus Property reaching operational net zero emissions earlier this year, so 8 years ahead of time for its core office portfolios. And our remaining managers are on track in terms of scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030. And our infrastructure managers have committed to net zero by 2050. Our second roadmap, this is where we set our 2050 target of net zero and a 45% reduction in emissions, real world emissions, I should say, by 2030. And our third roadmap we released just last week, our actions and measurement, includes, again, for the second time, specific actions in relation to embodied carbon in the built environment. So while good progress has been made in terms of operational emissions, embodied carbon is the next piece in the puzzle to start solving for. And it really is a very vexed and challenging issue, and it's where the hard work really begins. So part of this new roadmap, and to be really frank, part of our business as usual, is that we will be speaking to our property and infrastructure managers about how they're progressing against their commitments. In addition, consistent with the World Green Building Council, we will be engaging specifically with our property managers, just reminded Mark of this, to encourage them to commit by 30th of June 2024 to all new buildings and renovations having at least 40% less embodied carbon by 2030 and net zero embodied carbon by 2050. Now, this is really ambitious, but what gets measured gets managed, and the conversation and the actions really need to start somewhere. This is also where I think things like external frameworks, the regulatory environment and initiatives like the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative really play a key role, including, benchmark setters for property and infrastructure. They're all part of this important mix, and as Monica said, this ecosystem that can help us move along this path. They're going to be able to help us with things like definitions and starting points and evolutionary thinking to help us with roadmaps, monitoring, measuring and reporting. In terms of our infrastructure managers, our initial focus is going to be on estimation and measurement of embodied carbon. We hope to bake in more ambitious targets in the future. But in these conversations, what we're going to explore is how embodied carbon emissions are being estimated and measured, what targets are being set, and what actions are being undertaken to influence their supply chains. And we aim to share learnings, creating some, an effective feedback loop. And I think it's also worth mentioning that we also have a 1% allocation to climate opportunities and investments needed to support the transition. And this is for investments that don't currently fit within our existing risk return profile of our portfolios. We've seen a rush, to renewables and storage announcements, and this has been really, really positive in relation to operational emissions. But our focus needs to extend beyond operational emissions, and we and others, in the finance sector are really well placed to deploy capital into innovative projects across the built environment, such as new manufacturing, construction practices, the repurposing and upgrading of existing buildings, and recycling of materials. So I do think, as investors, we have got a role to play in driving demand for lower carbon materials, and we can do that through knowledge sharing events like this, setting expectations and targets for our property and infrastructure assets across the whole of the life of those assets, supporting appropriate policy settings and establishment of clear definitions through collaborative initiatives, and of course, allocating capital. So thank you so much for being either in person or online today. I do hope the event sparks, some connections and some really worthwhile conversations.